letting people join us in the Zoom room. So welcome everyone. We will be starting in just about a minute after we've let people enter the Zoom room. So sit tight, you're in the right place for the webinar entitled The View from Europe, Israel, Palestine, Biden, and Anti-Semitism. And we're going to start at about 2 minutes after the hour. So we're almost there. People are still joining us in the room. And thanks to everyone who's watching this on Facebook Live. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes, or less than a couple of minutes, so sit tight. All right, so I am going to start this now, and folks who join late will miss the introduction and they can watch it on the recording. So good morning and welcome everyone. I am Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today entitled The View from Europe, Israel, Palestine, Biden, and Anti-Semitism. As the United States prepares for the end of one presidential administration and the beginning of another, we are taking stock of the opportunities, burdens, and dynamics facing the European Union as it engages with Israel-Palestine. As the EU looks to the new Biden administration, what are its expectations around cooperation with the US? And what about the EU's role in the region? How does the EU assess and address Israel's new alliances in the Gulf or internal Palestinian and Israeli politics? And what are the impacts for Europe of the redefinition, the increasing redefinition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism, and to conflate settlements with the state of Israel? To discuss all of these issues and more, we are very proud to host a panel of experts from Europe, all of them people that I look to for my own understanding. We are so grateful for you joining us today. I'm going to introduce them all very briefly. Please see our website for their full bios, and I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, hopefully getting everyone's name right. We're starting with Dr. Muriel Asseburg, who is a senior fellow in the Middle East and Africa division at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, yay, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. We also have Dr. Dimitris Bouris, who is assistant professor and senior lecturer of EU security and European external relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. We then have Alexandra Gerasimchikova, yes, policy advisor of the ACT Alliance EU in Brussels. And last but not least, we have Dr. Anders Persson, who is senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Linnaeus University. As is the Foundation's regular practice, if you've been with us, you know this from previous webinars, the format for today's webinar will be a discussion between the panelists and myself. In addition to my own questions, we are, of course, eager to take audience questions. You can submit them at any time throughout the panel. I will be watching the Q&A box throughout the panel. Please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit your questions. If you put them in the chat box, I won't see them. So you're guaranteed I won't ask them. Please note this webinar is being live broadcast on Facebook, and it will be recorded, and the recording will be posted immediately after it ends, or as quickly as we can get it done. And if you have technical problems, that's what you should use the chat box for and nothing else. So, going to get started. We have so much to cover. I want to try to sort of start from big and then narrow in. So I want to start with Muriel. Muriel, what are Europeans expecting from a Biden administration with respect to the Middle East peace process, such as it is? And can you talk about the risks in this, and what should they be focusing on, perhaps rather than waiting for or hoping for leadership from a new Biden administration?
Thanks, Lara, and let me also thank you for inviting me to this. I think this is very timely, as a European, of course. So there's two main expectations I think that Europeans have with regards to a new administration. The first is that the US will return to a two-state approach, meaning a two-state approach that merits the name of two-state approach that takes into account the interests of both parties, Israelis and Palestinians, and is based on the international consensus, on the parameters, on international law. And the second expectation, I would say, is that the US does all of that and works with its allies and partners. And that means, of course, among them, the Europeans. And that means getting back to a multilateral approach towards the peace process or the conflict. Now, the main risk that I see in this is that the Europeans will be so relieved to have that kind of approach in a US administration that they will toe the US line once more, as they have done in the past, or as they did do in the past, without caring too much about the details that the US administration will put forward. And they get back into a supportive posture rather than trying themselves to being proactive and being alert. And so what I would like them to do is actually to focus on a strategic division of labor with the US rather than getting back into that comfortable situation. And the first thing that would need to be done, and what I would like the Europeans to push for, would be to restore the consensus actually on the parameters. And I think that already is an uphill struggle, and the Europeans should not wait for the US administration, the new administration, to come out with parameters, but rather push for them to be very much on the 2016 lines and not minus.
So that's a great start off. I think we're going to now dig deeper into exactly that. And by the way, I should add that for people on the webinar, you should monitor the chat box. My colleague has thrown up or put up the bios for all of our panelists. And I think throughout the panel, she'll be posting links to articles that relate to what the panelists are discussing, important things they've written. So definitely keep an eye on that. And all of those resources will be on the website afterwards as well. So I want to move now to Anders. I know you have written a lot about the EU's normative positions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You've done a lot of research on this and the importance of these positions, some of which Muriel just referenced. What are your main findings here? And where do these normative positions stand today in this moment when we are at the end of the bizarre Trump era and entering the unknown of a Biden era?
Well, thank you, Lara. The idea of the EU as a normative power goes back to the academic literature. It's based on a concept called normative power Europe, where the EU, as the largest bloc of liberal democracies in the world, can define many features of world politics and also what passes as normal in many aspects of world politics. And this is widely acknowledged, even by sort of top Israeli officials. I have a fantastic quote of a former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Dor Gold, when he says that on many issues in the UN, countries as diverse as, say, from Argentina to Japan, often looked at the European position when they voted for something in the UN. So the EU is often seen in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a crucial middle ground between the US and Israel on one hand, and the Palestinian and their Arab allies and others on the other hand. And we have seen this in many aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Actually going back to the early 1970s, when the EU started to legitimize the Palestinian movement. First, just talking about the Palestinians as having legitimate rights, the right to a homeland, the legal rights, the right to self-determination, and talks with the PLO. This was sort of the first decade. And the US and Israel often criticized the EU severely when they came out with these policy departures, and later on they adopted many of them themselves. We saw the same pattern repeating itself in the 1980s when the EU legitimized many of the features of the Oslo peace process, first of all having an international conference on the conflict, and also the two key principles of Oslo, which were mutual recognition and the land for peace. All of this materialized in the 1990s. Now, that is not to say that it was only because of the EU, coming out with these policy departures. But so it's very difficult to measure these kind of things and to establish causality. But what is clear here is that the EU has had an important sort of visionary vanguard role. In late 1990s, the EU stood behind the idea of a Palestinian state. This happened in 1997, a couple of years before America did the same. This was, of course, a big deal at the time. There was something unspeakable about, saying the term Palestinian state in the late 1990s. And then this continued with the recognition of East Jerusalem as a capital for a future Palestinian state. Now, this legitimizing power has also been important, say, when it comes to delegitimizing Hamas. The decision to place Hamas on a terror list was taken on the very symbolic date of September 11, 2003. And 2.5 years later, the Palestinians put their same group in their government. There's an ocean of discrepancy between these two decisions. Then we had the whole differentiation strategy. In 2013, the labels on settlement products and all these kind of things, which seems to be powerful for a couple of years. But right now, I think there are sort of two ways to look at this right now. On the one hand, I often challenge my students to say if they can come up with any issue in world politics where there is greater consensus than opposition to Israel's settlements. Nobody has succeeded with that so far. Now, having said that, we see, of course, that this consensus is beginning to unravel. We see it especially when it comes to East Jerusalem and also with these new peace and normalization agreements with the Gulf countries. So there has been great pushback to these parameters. And right now, I would say that the development on the ground is, of course, much stronger than the EU's normative positions. But for example, the Trump administration took these very, very seriously. And you know that better than anybody, Lara, because you've written a lot about it. And the whole sort of land for peace formula has been replaced now by a peace for peace formula, as the Israelis say. So I think they have been very important, but right now they are very weak. So that would be sort of the conclusion.
Yeah, I think what you've laid out is, in some ways, what demonstrates how important they were is how much energy has been spent directly challenging and trying to erode them, both
Exactly.
from the Israeli side and from the Trump administration and its allies. Alex, I want to turn to you. You're the person I look to interpret Brussels for me. You understand Brussels better than almost anyone I know. Looking at things from the view of the EU and Brussels, what are first impressions and policy expectations from folks in Brussels? So we're talking about the European Parliament and the EU bodies itself, about the Biden administration. And you and I've been in meetings in Brussels with you, along with you, where we basically, for 4 years, we're told we just have to wait for Biden, we have to wait for Trump to end. So we just have to get through this. And I'd also want to note, you have this emergence of more progressive voices in the US grassroots and in Congress, which I know some people in Europe are following closely. Does that have any relevance for the EU with regard to Israel, Palestine, and its policy in the Middle East?
Yes, well, thank you for such a nice introduction, Lara. I'm missing you very much here in Brussels with all the COVID restrictions. But indeed, I would agree also with what Muriel was saying earlier. I think there is, judging from the conversations that I've been having with some of the officials here in Brussels, but also in some of the capitals, of the like-minded states, we really have a very strong sense of relief here of the change of administration, and Biden coming up in the next term. At the same time, I do think that everyone is pretty much sober about expectations, what we can or cannot expect from the new administration, and also very much understanding that priorities in the Middle East will be focused on Iran. And I think that's pretty much similar for the EU as well. So in that sense, I don't think we will see any major shift, in the EU policy. I don't think there will be any sort of, now opportunity to rethink the EU's role in the Middle East, sadly. We even approach now time when Association Council is being again discussed with Israel, and it remains to be seen, how much member states will actually want to bring up the Middle East peace process, as a common position prerequisite before the council. I would also say that it's very interesting to observe, in fact, a sort of, annexation fatigue here in Brussels, but also amongst the officials in the capitals. There was a lot of discussions about what to do about, formal annexation, how the EU should respond. Then annexation was suspended. And I feel like there is nothing very tangible that remained from this conversation that would be basically carried forward now under the Biden administration for the EU. So there is nothing really tangible to work with, and just continue what has been done, in a more supportive role from the EU, for example, with regard to the Palestinian elections. Now, good that you mention the progressive voices, because I do think it's a very important, opportunity for us to engage with that. And I think this aspect of transatlantic cooperation is in fact the most exciting one. I don't know if the colleagues Anders and Dimitris would also agree, but I would say that the EU foreign policy thinking is in fact quite old-fashioned. It's very normative indeed, but it doesn't really adopt to 2020 and to the challenges we see in the future. So I think specifically on Israel and Palestine, it will be definitely great in terms of mainstreaming conversation about Israel and Palestine, especially in an environment where now in Europe this conversation becomes more and more difficult and hostile environment. And I think that more broadly, it will be also very important, to bring more the ethical component of foreign policy back into into discussion here in Brussels, even just with the institutions, not to mention the importance of these kind of conversations on the member states levels, how to, also include economic justice very much in conversations about foreign policy, and somehow, challenge this untouchability of trade in external affairs. I think it's one of the strongest, if not the very strong tool that the EU has, but it's absolutely separate from any decision making, and it's a pity, I think.
Thank you. And there's a couple of points I want to come back to later on in the conversation that you raised, and I'll just foreshadow one of them, which is, as much as the EU wants to sort of go into this passive, we're relieved, going forward, do whatever the US wants kind of role, it seems to me that the EU and the US are on a collision course over differentiation. At a minimum, we're on a collision course over differentiation, labeling, all of that. We can get back into that later. But I want to just put that out there for you all to think about, because I'm going to ask you about it. Dimitris, you have written extensively on the EU's role in the Palestinian state building efforts. And I think we're going to throw into the box a link to your book, which is terrific. People should read it. Where do we stand today with regard to the EU's involvement in this, in terms of state building institutions, in terms of support for, there has to be elections, all of that stuff?
Thank you, Lara, and thank you for the invitation as well. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. Where do we stand today? The short response is that there is neither a state nor state building. The only building which we can see is settlement building. But let me elaborate a little bit more. And in general, we can observe 3 periods of state building in Palestine, especially when it comes to the involvement of the international community. The first period, the Oslo Accords from 1993 to 2000. Then the second period of state building with the roadmap, 2002, 2003 until 2006. And then the third period of state building after the West Bank first approach of 2007, 2008, and especially with the Fayyad plan during 2009, 2011. Now, the logic of all these initiatives has always been the same, how state building can be used as a conflict resolution tool in essence. Because it was hoped that if the Palestinians started building their own institutions and they were also able to demonstrate to the international community and to Israel that they are able to govern their own affairs and also guarantee security for Israel, then this would lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, the Oslo Accords, as we all know, were supposed to be temporary, and they focused on this idea of peace now. The EU provided over half the funding needed to set up all these embryonic quasi-state institutions. And then in the second period of state building with the roadmap, we moved to the idea of democracy now. So democracy now, peace later, which was the contrary from the Oslo years. Again, the logic remained the same, to create a confidence building environment where both Israelis and Palestinians would take simultaneous steps, which would eventually lead to full Palestinian statehood by the end of 2005. Now, you don't need me to tell you that this never happened. And instead of witnessing such establishment of a Palestinian state, Hamas won the 2006 Palestinian elections. And then we have the third period starting after Hamas's takeover of Gaza and the initiation of the West Bank first approach. Now, the Fayyad plan, the state building plan of Fayyad 2009-2011 was probably the most clever political plan that the Palestinians have ever taken in this domain. Because although it was not explicitly mentioned, the idea was that, Fayyad would build all these institutions needed and then leave it up to the international community to recognize the state. And it did. In the end of all this period in 2011, we had all major international organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and the EU arguing that the Palestinians had reached the threshold of statehood, that Palestinian institutions favorably compared to institutions in existing recognized states. But again, this did not lead to statehood, and it only eventually just led to the upgrade of Palestine at the United Nations to non-member observer state. So the main plank of the EU strategy has been to help prepare Palestine for statehood. The EU is spending around 500 million euros a year in this Palestinian state building. But all this made sense when it was nested within some kind of peace talks. While what we have been witnessing in the last couple of years is that European countries continue pouring funds for this institution and state building without any clear political objectives. So someone can argue that all this funding has become unbalanced and has contributed to the propping up of an increasingly dysfunctional Palestinian Authority. Europeans are stuck in kind of implementing this familiar agenda of institution building initiatives almost by default without acknowledging that this approach has run out of steam. There is only so much institutional capacity building that the EU can undertake, and the Palestinians are the most well-trained peoples in the world, someone can argue. So the payback of all these billions of euros of supporting Palestinian state building has been disappointing. Palestine today is politically fractured, authoritarian, and dysfunctional. So there is a kind of backsliding in state building. And it hasn't worked. The whole state building approach as conflict resolution hasn't worked for almost 30 years. So the facade of state building is slowly being removed, and it has become absolutely clear that all this was just an illusion and that the state building project has failed. So the illusion that if you look like a state, act like a state, and behave like a state, then you're probably a state has been broken.
Yeah, I would also mention that if you talk to Palestinians and many analysts, they'll also argue that it's not just the funding has propped up, a failed state. It's also the argument being that it's facilitated and lubricated occupation all these years. I'd recommend to folks who didn't watch it, we did a webinar last month with 3 Palestinians who are focused on the idea of needing to change the economic aid structure for Palestinians. It's really interesting. I highly recommend it. Sticking with you for a moment, Dimitris, can you talk about, sort of moving on to the round of looking forward, can you talk about what your expectations are with respect to cooperation between the US and the EU in the region, and particularly in Israel-Palestine? Do you see this as a sigh of relief and we're going to just return to the pre-Trump status quo, or is there something else? And I should say to everyone, as I'm moderating, I have a new puppy wandering around my house who may end up on my lap, which is better than him howling in the background. So you've been warned.
Thank you, Lara. I'll try to be brief. I think that there has been relief in most, if not all, European capitals with the election of Biden. The last 4 years have created several shadows in the transatlantic relationship, which moved away from the principles of multilateralism to US unilateralism, specifically in the Middle East and more specifically in Israel and Palestine. The policies of Trump have had overwhelmingly negative effects. with all these unqualified support for Israel and the hostile approach towards Palestinians as well. All the different agreements and international frameworks for resolving the conflict have been shaken. And although the European Union has managed to keep these parameters of a two-state solution alive, I think that this kind of approach is starting to exhausting itself, if it hasn't exhausted itself already. But I also want to say that Trump's policies also had a positive effect. And please don't take me wrong, I'm not a Trump supporter, but I think that the positive effect that they had was that masks were fallen off. And there was no more pretending anymore that there is a process or that there is a peace process taking place. These policies also expose the deep divisions within the EU, which could not offer a decisive response to Trump's unilateral initiatives, but not even earlier this year to the Israeli threat of annexation. The High Representative of the EU argued that annexation would inevitably have significant consequences on ties between the EU and Israel. But all of us who have been following the EU's policy towards the conflict knew that all these are empty rhetoric and nothing else. As was mentioned before, I don't think that Israel-Palestine will be a high priority for the Biden administration. I think most of the focus will be probably on Iran and the JCPOA. And yes, we will probably go back. In theory, we will return to the pre-Trump era and the hope that some kind of reinvigoration of the transatlantic relationship will happen. But whether this is good or bad news, I'm not sure. That's a different story. It is important to return to multilateralism and respect for international law. But this hasn't brought any change on the ground in Israel or Palestine for the last 30 years. So Palestinians will continue being treated as a virtual state. The Israeli occupation will continue entrenching itself. And I think that's it.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about the puppy. Okay, so hold on a second. This is the least professional thing I've ever had happen on a webinar. I'm so sorry. I hope people will be understanding. That was all very depressing. Muriel, I want to move to something equally depressing, but interesting. When we did this webinar a while ago on the Palestinian economic aid, we had Ala Tartir on, who is amazing. And he had the sort of mic drop sentence of the whole thing. And his quote was, "The US decides, the World Bank leads, the EU pays, the UN feeds, and Israel destroys," which I've come to understand is actually a play on something that Anne Limor said in 2005. It's a powerful framing. And Demetrius was just talking about the EU role in subsidizing, that being the main role it has played. Can you talk about why, until now, the EU has had a hard time being a player rather than merely a payer? Why is it so hard in the past and even today for the EU to match its rhetoric and its principled policies, to the extent they exist, on Israel-Palestine to its actions?
Well, we have something that is called the European Foreign and Security Policy, but it's not a common policy. It's still, we have the sovereignty with the member states. And I think there's many reasons, but there's two main reasons why this is so difficult and why Europe is so divided on Israel-Palestine. And I think Anders said it in the beginning, Europe is not divided when it comes to the principles and the parameters, but it's very divided when it comes to the approach. How do we get to the result that we want to see? We don't have agreement among EU member states on how to nudge the parties to the conflict to where we want them to be. We don't have agreement on what role should the conflict play in our relations, in the bilateral relations with Israel. We don't have agreement on what role the conflict should play at all. Is that a priority or not? We don't have agreement on the instruments that are there. Should we work with incentives or disincentives? Somebody spoke about sanctions earlier. This is a no-go for some member states, like Germany. Other member states can think about that. What about recognition of Palestine? That is, again, something that member states have done, Sweden, and it's a no-go for others. Association Council, how to deal with the situation on the ground. So basically, on every instrument on how we deal with the conflict, we have disagreements among member states. And that is due to a variety of reasons: historical experiences, identities of the countries, the self-view of countries, political cultures, closeness to the US, grievances that actually are linked to issues in other policy areas and have nothing to do with the Middle East, also impact on how member states work on the Middle East. These divisions have increased markedly, I would say, over the last few years. And that has to do, among other issues, with the rise of right-wing populist policies or politics in Europe. It also has to do with divisive policies of the government of Israel, which has tried to build relations with member states or groups of member states that would then veto joint European action. And that has led to a situation where European member states do not agree and cannot, the potential weight that they actually could throw into the balance, and that is the trade relations with Israel, and that is the donor relations with the PA, cannot throw them in the balance as a union. Maybe one more issue that I think is important in that regard, and that is member states and policymakers in more general terms have really been put on the defensive in these last few years. The accusations of anti-Semitism has really been a very powerful instrument, and that has worked against the EU. I mean, remember that the Wissenschaft Center has accused the EU as being one of the most anti-Semitic entities when it introduced its policy of differentiation in terms of correct indication of labeling. It has picked out not the Wiesenthal Center, but other entities, in particular the Ministry of Strategic Affairs under Gilad Erdan, NGO Monitor. Other entities have picked out specific policymakers and accused them of anti-Semitism. And that has also led to a situation where politicians and member states have not followed up on common stances, have not explained them to the public, and have been very, very hesitant, reluctant to take a stance and to follow up and propagate EU policies. And this is where we are. And this is why the EU has given such a weak picture. And even though we have seen quite a lot of activism and engagement of Europeans this summer against annexation, Europeans were not able to agree on a joint statement, even though they agreed on the principles. Again, no joint statement against annexation and on the consequences that annexation would have for EU-Israel relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and by the way, the puppy is gone, so hopefully no more interruptions, no more cuteness interruptions. I think you have covered some really important concepts for Americans, certainly, to understand. I think for a lot of us, our assumption is if there is disunity or an inability to have a coherent outlook on Israel-Palestine, we assume it's about Israel-Palestine, when in fact, it's more of a symptom of the evolutions and problems or challenges within the EU itself. And in some ways, it's an aggravating factor. People use it as an aggravating factor. And I think it's also really important, that last part you just said. I mean, I think it's worth reminding people that when the EU adopted its policy of differentiation between Israel and settlements, which at the time was advisory, it wasn't mandatory, it was actually criticized by Israel as a Nazi policy. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I believe that year named the EU as the top or one of the top anti-Semitic individuals or entities in the world, right? Because of a differentiation policy between settlements and Israel. It was quite extraordinary, and it was a really powerful foreshadowing of where this would go and how those accusations of anti-Semitism would be wielded, particularly in Europe and now increasingly in the US. So thank you for that. Anders, I want to come back to you. You have written in your more recent research about what you call the authoritarian turn of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is fascinating. I want you to take a few moments to flesh out for us what you mean by this. And it really flows nicely from what Muriel just laid out, and what you think this shift in the politics of Israel, but also in Palestine, might mean or come to mean for European policy.
Yeah, well, I've had sort of a side project over the last couple of years where I have collected and compiled all data from democracy rating indexes regarding Israel and Palestine, and also local data from organizations like Israel Democracy Institute and the like. Now, bear in mind that it's very difficult to measure democracy both in occupying societies like the Palestinian society and in occupying societies like Israel. But having said that, I mean, there is one trend which is so clear in the data, and that is what I call the authoritarian turn. And this is very clear. I mean, if we go back to 2006, we see that the Palestinians back then were among the freest and most democratic societies in the Middle East, again, within occupation, of course, but they had just completed successful democratic elections, resulting in the victory for an opposition party. Now, that is not a small thing. It's a huge thing in the Middle East before the Arab Spring. Maybe the first time it ever happened, depending on how you count Lebanon in the 1970s. So that was a big thing. And back then, 15 years ago, Israel was by far considered to be the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. Now, if we go forward to 2020, we see that Gaza is one of the most authoritarian societies in the world. We see that democracy, freedom, human rights are in absolute free fall in the West Bank. And we see, even in Israel, we see in some of these indexes, Israel is no longer considered a liberal democracy. In some, Tunisia is ranked ahead of Israel as the only, or as the most democratic state in the Middle East. So this is a powerful development. Now, exactly what it will mean for the future is difficult for me to say, but I sort of think a lot about, will this make a peaceful resolution of the conflict easier or harder? And I'm not really sure about the answer there, because we have seen over the past 15 years also a sort of a global decline in democracy. At the same time, we have seen a global decline in wars as well, and casualties in war. So they are this is a Steven Pinker argument. So there is a sort of authoritarian peace in the world, and we see it, of course, both in Gaza and the West Bank, where we have this as well. But I mean, it's very clear that right now, for example, people in Gaza cannot even speak with Israelis. They're arrested if they do that on Zoom. And we see not exactly the same tendencies in the West Bank, but a little bit less severe. And also in Israel, we see, of course, that people advocating for certain left-wing positions like B'Tselem or Breaking the Silence have their events canceled, and that they can't really speak out. So this is a very serious development. And every time I meet an Israeli diplomat, I tell them, take this seriously. You know, this is a much bigger issue for you than BDS, for example. And, you know, from an Hasbara perspective, Hasbara is sort of the Israeli propaganda or public relations strategy. It makes a lot of difference if you say, hey, I am a diplomat from the only liberal democracy in the world, or in the Middle East, I'm sorry. That is very different from saying, well, you know, hey, I am a diplomat from the second least authoritarian country in the Middle East. It has an enormous effect from when it comes to Israeli public diplomacy. And Israel today, they are falsely saying that they are the only liberal democracy in the world. That is factually incorrect.
Well, I've also got to think it's factually at odds with things like Israeli diplomats in Brussels lobbying Europe to blacklist Israeli NGOs that are critical of Israel, which is an ongoing issue. You mentioned B'Tselem, breaking the silence. I mean, we all know this. I know Alex works with a lot of these NGOs directly. In the past, certainly the past 4 years, but even before that, the really very open effort by the Israeli government, which for years, one of the ways it defended itself against criticisms about human rights or anything else was to point to its vibrant civil society sector. And in the past 4 years, but again, even before that, the Israeli policy has been to really aggressively delegitimize that sector, and particularly in Europe, which is sees as funding that sector and therefore part of the problem. So
it has been going on for a decade, since 2011. And I mean, the two main reasons why Israel is falling, for example, in Freedom House's rankings, is one, because of illiberal legislation in the Knesset. Some of this is related to the NGOs, and the authoritarian tendencies of the prime minister. These are the two reasons why Israel is falling.
Yeah, so important. Alex, shifting to you, I don't know if you remember the last time that I saw you in Brussels back before COVID. You and I were doing a round of meetings. You brought me to see a lot of people. And in every one of those meetings, because I really try to offer people reasons to be, empowered and confident. And in every meeting, I raised the issue of Han al-Ahmar with my interlocutors. This is the hamlet in the West Bank, this village in the West Bank that Israel really wants to demolish. And the EU has engaged forcefully, urging Israel not to demolish it. And the EU has a lot of investments in Han al-Ahmar. And I said to all my European interlocutors, this is an example of how consequential European engagement can be, because Israel has not dared to demolish Han al-Ahmar so far. And I don't know if you remember, the response you and I got from every single interlocutor was, well, yes, but we know they're going to demolish it eventually. And then I would say, well, if you know they're going to demolish it eventually, what is Europe doing to make clear that there will be consequences if that happens? And the answer was, there won't be any unity. We won't be able to do anything. And that was really just gut-wrenching for me. That was over a year ago. So fast forward to today. And over the past months, we have seen major advancements in settlement expansion in areas in and around East Jerusalem that the EU considers particularly detrimental to the viability of the two-state solution. And in response, we've seen some pretty weak statements and no sign of willingness for action. Can you talk about whether that might change under a Biden administration? Maybe the weakness we're getting so far in response is that people are waiting for a Biden administration so they can get tougher in cooperation. I'm hoping you'll say something encouraging here.
Yes, I will try. I'll do my best. So first, reacting to your impression from the Brussels meetings, yeah, I think there's something very paradoxical about the EU attitude, about its achievements or non-achievements. Whenever you tell them you did something good, they really underestimate themselves. But whenever they need to defend themselves, they really overestimate their capabilities. But one thing is clear, that I think most of the people who really work on the file in the capitals in Brussels really understand these issues very, very well, including these, areas particularly detrimental to the two-state solution, as the EU sometimes called them in the past, the red lines. That means that some of the issues that were already specifically pinpointed in previous Foreign Affairs Council conclusions. So translating into a more understandable terms, of foreign policy, it means that there is already a basis for a common united foreign policy. So I think it's also interesting to look beyond this, beyond just always blaming this unanimity on Foreign Affairs Council for all the woes that we have. There's also a problem of different approaches that go in terms of implementation of this already agreed on policy, basically. Specifically, for example, on expansion of settlements, in Iran and Givat Hamatos, how to react to that. A lot of member states have different desires how to react to this, if to do it, bilaterally, if you do it privately, publicly, if to do it with the help of the EU programming or just with statements. There is everything, in the cards there. I would say also particularly interesting is, also the question of leadership. So it's not just in terms of, different approaches, but in terms of leadership. Some of the favorites quotes, we have in the meetings when we talk with some really like-minded states, they are very keen, we are very happy to support this action. We are happy, to take a lead, basically. But first find us a member state that is willing to take the lead on it, but we are like, but you're the leading state on it, you know? So we can never find this one leading state under which everyone else bandwagons, basically. That's also a very, very palpable problem here, I think. I think with regard to the question, you know, if the Biden administration can make the EU more willing to act on this, I think I will not answer that because that's a pretty negative response here. But I think what's more interesting is actually to reverse the question and say if the EU can influence the Biden administration to act down the line, in fact. I think here the EU can do more to influence basically the administration's calculations down the line, you know, and costs of engaging in some sort of, you know, renewed peace building efforts and going away from conflict management if the conditions allow, again, in the near future. I think here the EU does have quite, you know, strong ability basically to ensure or, you know, to somehow really put a lot of effort also in terms of policy to back up their rhetoric and making the parties really accountable for steps that undermine basically the peace prospects. Again, I think for this, there is already a toolbox available that does not need to have more agreements on Foreign Affairs Council. This is something that can be applied in terms of institutions. But I think we can also discuss that probably later in some other questions.
Well, actually, I want to follow up right now with you because the toolbox is really interesting to me. And you wrote a really interesting article for this, which I think will be thrown up into the chat box. Before annexation was suspended, sanctions were reported as one of the options on the table in terms of the EU's possible reaction to if there was a formal annexation. Obviously, the situation is different now, but you wrote about the toolbox. And it's a toolbox for the EU and also EU member states. Can you talk some more about that?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting, Jonah, to think about the EU's attitude about sanctions in this case. I think it's also quite a different to apply sanctions on your ally, you know, on a country that you have very good relationship with. I mean, other than the Middle East peace process, of course, or on a regime where you're not so invested, you know, or there is some sort of animosity already. I mean, today, right here, you know, a couple of meters away, there are discussions whether or not, or like what to do about Turkey right now for Europe. So it's definitely a broader problem. I think there is one issue I think that we for sure have is the fact that if you sanction, you need to, of course, have unanimous vote on that. There was efforts, you know, to introduce qualified majority voting, so not unanimous vote, basically to approve sanctions. But I would argue that even that is not a panacea, you know, that is not a solution to European problems in terms of using sanctions as a useful tool. Because we have states as Germany, for example, that Muriel also just mentioned, that will not want to use sanctions for Israel. And it's, you know, sure, I'm not a, you know, 100% supporter of sanctions. It's more about what else you do in terms of your foreign policy other than sanctions.
So I would encourage people to read Alex's article because it's really quite thoughtful and there's ideas there that I had not seen before. Thank you for that. Dimitris, I want to move to you. The core of the EU's Middle East peace policy, and this has been referenced earlier, is its unwavering commitment to the two-state solution. Can you talk more about this framing and what it means, both positive and negative, for European policy and its likely actions and options going forward?
I'll do my best not to be a party pooper once again and be all negative. So I'll try to get some inspiration from Alexandra's positivism. Indeed, I mean, someone can say that the EU is the only actor left still believing in a two-state solution. Not even the Palestinians or the Israelis believe in it anymore. It took the EU more than 40 years to adopt a clear policy with regard to the conflict. And although Anders mentioned that the EU was visionary back in 1980 with the Venice Declaration, which called, in essence, excuse me, for a two-state solution and the inclusion of the PLO, etc. Now, the positive side of this unwavering commitment to the two-state solution was the EU's ability to get involved in the Palestinian state building, to invest huge amounts of money towards the realization of a Palestinian state. And by investing or spending these amounts of money. They also managed to get a seat in the table of the negotiations by being a consistent actor, arguing in favor of respect for international law, at least in rhetoric. Now, the importance of this commitment was also observed more recently, especially in the last 4 years of Trump's presidency, and the effort and success in shaking things up and moving away from this international consensus. In these last 4 years, having an actor still believing in a two-state solution in accordance with international law as the best solution was important in tackling all these realities that Trump created. Now, despite all this, there are negative implications as well. First of all, the EU being stuck in this two-state solution has affected the EU's ability for fresh thinking and approaches. The EU is largely failing to realize the shifting of realities on the ground, and it's really stuck in this paradigm of two states. This is even more worrying as no other actor anymore believes in a two-state solution, not the Israelis, not the Palestinians. So all this has resulted to the EU becoming a delusional actor, which is detached from the realities and the perceptions on the ground. Another negative thing is that the EU is not an actor which is quick in responding and reacting, as Muriel also mentioned earlier, when things and events unfold. So by being stuck in this two-state paradigm, the EU cannot offer any new fresh thinking of how to tackle this conflict. And then another negative implication is the hypocrisy of the EU's belief in a two-state solution, which has been revealed by the EU's unwillingness to recognize a Palestinian state, despite the fact that it has spent billions of euros to build this state. But I think that the biggest problem is the lack of listening to any kind of voices from the ground and a deep unwillingness to embark on fresh thinking about what is realistic and what is not.
I think that's so powerful, and I always argue it's not pessimistic to see the facts as they are. It's fine to try to come up with an optimistic slant, but the facts are what they are. To deny the facts is actually delusional, and you get to bad policy if you deny facts. Muriel, I want you to go further into this issue of the Europeans and the two-state solution. One of the arguments I've heard from European interlocutors for years is, okay, it's obviously disconnected from anything happening on the ground, and we all get that, but this is the one thing around which we have unity. We don't dare let go of it. Why do you think Europe clings to the two-state mantra? And do you think this argument that it's better than letting it go, because if you let it go, there'll be nothing positive and constructive to rally around, does that have merit? And assuming it's not going to change, what do you think Europe should be doing to try to align its policies to that two-state focus?
Yeah, Lara, I'll answer in a second. I wanted to get back to something that Anders said earlier, because I think it's also important. One of the realities is also that, and I turn around the question that you asked, Anders, the repercussions, you asked about the repercussions for conflict resolution of both societies or both political systems turning towards authoritarian governance in different degrees, of course, right? And I would turn it the other way around. Europeans have not only engaged in state building, they have also made it they stressed so much that they're building a democratic Palestinian entity. And it's important to see that as long as there is no conflict resolution, but to the contrary, we move ever more towards an annexation and a one-state reality with unequal rights, there is no liberal democracy, and Europeans are not in a position to build a liberal democracy in the Palestinian areas. I mean, the contradiction that is there also needs to be taken account of. We, the Europeans, return to the Palestinians and ask them to be more democratic. But in the system we are looking at, there is no possibility. You cannot uphold occupation in a democratic system where people can vote if they want to have that kind of policy or not. So they cannot vote freely, and that is the reality we're in.
Thank you for adding that. That's so important. So thank you. Now back to two-state solution. Sorry about that.
No, it's. I wanted to make that point. Why are the Europeans clinging so much to the two-state mantra? And I would say really mantra because it's not an orientation for European policies. It's an empty formula, or it has become an empty formula. I think there is two main reasons. One is that if Europeans were to move away from that formula, they would get into direct, if they move towards a binational state, they move into direct confrontation or contradiction with Israel's self-definition as a Jewish and democratic state and as a safe haven for Jews. And that is very unlikely to happen against the backdrop of European history, starting with the Balfour, well, starting before the Balfour Declaration, but mentioning the Balfour Declaration and of course, genocide that took place in Europe against European Jewry. So to go against that self-understanding is very difficult against that backdrop, unless there is significant Jewish-Israeli support for it. Then of course that consideration would be different. And the second one, you've been speaking about it, and Dimitris has also spoken about it. There is path dependency, of course. 40 years of fleshing out a position with values, strategies, policy instruments are not easily revised. And trying to revise them in a situation where you have such large divisions between member states and you have completely different policy priorities among most of the member states really risks you ending up in a situation where you lose the so-called acquis of the member states on that issue and you end up with having nothing. I think that is a considerable risk, and one shouldn't dive into that lightly. My experience of speaking to policymakers who are not privy to the discussions about Israel-Palestine, they have all somehow gotten used to use two states, the two-state formula as an anchor to support Palestinian ambitions, Palestinian rights. Once we take away that anchor, I fear that there will be nothing of that sort that would motivate people, at least of the older generation, to engage. Now, of course, I know that there are other options, and I would argue to go towards other options. I'm just speaking about that this will be very difficult to get it anchored in the policy debate among a more conservative clientele. So that leaves us with, if the Europeans want to have an impact on what is happening on the ground, with a more consistent engagement in favor of a two-state approach, which would not necessarily be in contradiction with a rights-based approach anyhow. Right? To the contrary, it should not be in contradiction. And that would call for, I think, first and foremost, consistent differentiation, not only applying the instrument, implementing the instruments that are there, but moving further than that. I think the most logical thing to have would be an import ban on settlement products into the EU. If you think that these entities are contrary to international law, why would you engage in trade with them in the first place? Recognition of a Palestinian state would be a forceful signal in that regard. The question of rethinking how Europeans work with the Palestinians, support them, would also be very important. How can Europeans actually do something more substantial than to date to prevent forced displacement? Europeans are looking at Area C and are engaged in Area C. What about East Jerusalem? What about the old city of Hebron? The change, the transition that is happening there, Europeans are basically absent. So that is one area to engage in, I think. In general, Europeans need to rethink how can they support Palestinians on the ground without engaging and without legitimizing occupation authorities. And the more annexation moves ahead, de facto annexation moves ahead, the more complicated that actually becomes. With regards to the Palestinian political system, Palestinian governance, I also think that Europeans need to, even if they don't do the big rethink of policies, need to at least put on the, examine where do they stand in the way of a renewal of representative institutions. And the no contact policy that has been mentioned towards Hamas definitely is one issue here. The West Bank first approach that is still actually valid and dominant is one important issue here. The question of not linking support to the PA to performance when it comes to governance is one issue that is at stake here. So those are things that need to be revisited. What I fear is that Europeans go and break it down again to the formal level of institutions only, and they will ask the Palestinians to have elections, and they will support elections because then presumably we will have a new Palestinian leadership that can engage in negotiations, and then we move on. Last point, very shortly, because I've been speaking a long time already. Conflict settlement actually is also an area that I think the Europeans should be engaging in. It's nothing that is on the table right now. As I said earlier, it's important to go back to the parameters and make sure very early in the Biden administration that we actually do have shared parameters that we can build on, but then also work on the framework under which, once the conditions are there, and they are not today, once they are there, negotiations can take place, talks can take place, because in the end, we will have to go back to talks.
Thank you. That was really, really thorough and excellent. I want to also just recommend for people who are on this webinar, there was a paper released yesterday from the European Council on Foreign Relations entitled "The End of Oslo, a New European Strategy on Israel-Palestine." It is really interesting. I recommend it highly, and I think my colleague will probably throw a link to that paper into the chat box. So Anders, I want to come back to you, and I want to shift gears a little bit. There's been numerous references so far in the conversation to the issue of anti-Semitism and the role that claims and attacks about anti-Semitism have played so far, right? So I know that next year there's going to be a big conference in Sweden about what is known as the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which most people now call IRA, like my great uncle kind of thing, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is terribly problematic. And there's going to be a conference next year on that, postponed because of COVID. Can you talk about this conference? Can you talk a little bit about the IRA definition itself and the examples and how they're being treated and discussed in Europe today? And I'll add here that we're actually doing a webinar specifically about this on Monday, but we wanted to also address it here because it's so important to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Lara. Well, IRA was from the beginning a Swedish initiative, and many people forget that today, but it was an initiative taken in the late 1990s by our former prime minister, who wanted to highlight Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust education more broadly. And for a long time, for about 20 years or so, it was an obscure organization that nobody paid any attention to. But this, of course, changed when the new definition and examples, we call it the frame and the examples, were adopted in 2016. Now, keep in mind that the need for these kind of things, Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism education, cannot be underestimated. I'm sitting and speaking to you from a small city north of Malmö, and I can tell you every time I go to Malmö and talk to students about these kind of issues, full hell is raised. So I mean, the need for this to be implemented somehow cannot be underestimated. And Sweden also has a big neo-Nazi scene. We have by far the most right-wing terrorist attacks per capita in Western Europe over the past 25 years. Some anti-Semitism coming from the left wing, and also a lot among the Muslims, many of whom are not Islamists. So I mean, the need for the discussion and the debate cannot be underestimated. But of course, and the first point I would make is that IRA debate has so far not sort of come down to ordinary people on the street. So if I go out here and ask somebody, nobody would have any clue at all what IRA is about. And even among policymakers and sort of academic and think tank people, there is very little understanding, I would say. But as you said, Laura, next year there will be a big conference about this. And I spoke to some of the organizers some time ago, and they were, of course, afraid that the whole focus would be on the definition, the examples, and the freedom of speech issues, which I think it will be. But they sort of wanted to go back to this broader, say, education strategy and remembrance. Let's say, if difficult to say exactly what will happen, and now we know the Trump officials will not be there, so that maybe it will be easier to sort of scale back a little bit. But I have tried to raise awareness about this here in Sweden, and I wrote an article in one of the leading newspapers some time ago where I sort of highlighted 3 of the problems. And the first is the vagueness of the definition, and especially the examples. The second point was the focus on Israel. 7 of 11 examples are about Israel. And third is the application and the abuse connected to the application of it. And there is nobody who better sort of represent this than our former foreign minister, Margot Wallström. And she has sort of been probably the politician in the Western world who has been most in the crosshair of Israel over the past decades. And I can give you an example. I mean, 4 years ago, she said that Israel was conducting extrajudicial executions. Now, that is a factually correct statement. And if somebody listening to this would like to have references, you should read Ronenbergen's book, and then you should read Amnesty and Human Rights Watch reports. So it's a factually correct statement. Now, that is being portrayed by some, columnists in the Jerusalem Post and others as a typical classical example of anti-Semitism based on the IRA definition. So here you have the perfect example of how a factually correct statement can be abused. And if you Google her name, Margot Wallström plus anti-Semitism in English, you get 30,000 matches. And I know some of the people who have been working with her, and she has been felt terribly bad because of these accusations. And also, to spin it a little bit more, right after she said this, she was invited to be a guest of honor speaker at the national Swedish organization that combated anti-Semitism. And a month later, she made it to the Wiesenthal list. We also see here, of course, a split among organizations combating anti-Semitism. I think it's wrong to call it a left and right wing split, because the organization here in Sweden is not a left wing organization, even if it is easier to sort of see it that way. So these are sort of some of the problems. I often tell people when I have these discussions that I grew up with the Muhammad cartoons. They happened here, just across the strait in Denmark. And then the year after, we had Lars Vilks drawing a painting of Muhammad as a dog. Now, this has sort of defined my whole time as a teacher at the university. Every time I raise this in class, I'm afraid I will get a knife in my back when I walk out of the classroom. And so this was sort of the big debate of freedom of expression over the past decade. I think IRA will be the big debate of freedom of expression in Europe and in the US over the next decade. Probably not as bad as the Muhammad cartoons, but bad enough.
Oh, that's sobering. I'm going to shift up the order because I want to go to Muriel now, because there was news today that relates directly to what Anders was just talking about. There's news out of Germany. And, there's been references now to IRA definition and anti-Semitism. Germany has in some ways been ground zero, weird word to use, I know, but ground zero for this fight in Europe because of obviously the historical baggage that Germany carries and has to carry, should carry, given the history there. The news today, though, is about the beginnings of what sounds like a real pushback after, months and months and months, if not years, of witch hunts targeting cultural institutions and academics and all that. Can you talk about that? And can you also maybe address what I mentioned earlier, my concern that Europe is on a collision course with the US on this, because in the US, the IRA definition is on the ascendant, obviously. And the Trump administration, it sounds like before they leave office, is going to start, is going to issue a list of NGOs calling them anti-Semitic. And these are probably not NGOs that get US funding. It sounds like they're going to be Palestinian NGOs, but they're Palestinian NGOs that get European funding. It sounds to me like this is largely supposed to be a name and shame and wind beneath the wings of efforts by the Israeli government, NGO Monitor, et cetera, to delegitimize these organizations and force Europe to blacklist them. All of which links together to fundamentally what is anti-Semitism. So can you talk about the developments today and how they fit into the bigger battle?
Sure, I'm really happy about this because it was such an important initiative that got public today. Maybe to take one step back about the background, we had a resolution in German Parliament in May last year that held that BDS, the boycott, sanctions, divestment movement, was anti-Semitic in its methods and line of argumentation, and that therefore no public funding should go to BDS organizations or individuals linked to BDS, and also that no public space should be rented out or made available to BDS linked activities. Since then, we've seen an enormous pressure. I mean, the pressure was there before, because it was also linked to the IRA definition that was adopted by the government and by parliament, but it has increased substantially after this BDS resolution by German parliament, which, one has to say, it doesn't have any legal quality. It's a resolution, it's not a law. Still, the pressure on institutions to withdraw funding, to disinvite people when there was a suspicion that they were linked to BDS has increased enormously since then. And we have seen an enormous amount of cancellation of events, disinvitation of artists, of speakers, because allegedly they were supporting BDS or were close to BDS or knew somebody or were in teaching with somebody who supported BDS or allegedly supported BDS. And the most prominent example that happened this summer was the invitation as a keynote speaker of Achille Mbembe to the Ruhr Triennale. And again, we had a storm against him in which also the German anti-Semitism coordinator engaged, accusing Mbembe of supporting BDS and therefore being anti-Semitic. And so he was disinvited. Now, this initiative that came out today unites all the big publicly funded German cultural and research institutions. It's non-partisan, and the main emphasis is on guaranteeing the freedom of the arts and sciences in the attempt of remaining, or in the effort of remaining cosmopolitan, remaining open to the world, and not narrowing down the debate in Germany to one perspective only. That also goes, of course, back to the discussion about Germans' past, not only in the Nazi era, era, but also to the German colonial past, and not trying to cancel out victims of one epoch through victims of the other. So the main intention of the initiative is to maintain the public space that allows for dissent, that allows for solidarities that are multi-layered, that are diverse, to allow for critical reflection, and to also allow for alternative visions for the world that we share, actually. And I think this is very encouraging, because it's the first time we have had these institutions that all depend on public funding and that also have a role in research and in education to make that point so strongly. And it's also important because they're not the usual suspects linked to Israel-Palestine, but general institutions. Now, will that put Europeans, or in that case Germans, into a coalition course with the US regarding the application of IRA? And I don't see that. I mean, this is not the state that has spoken. It's an initiative by institutions. I do hope very much that it does create a different climate here in Germany. And I also hope that this can be an example for other European states. And that maybe also it has an impact on the discussion in the US. But I don't see that it can halt the general trend in the way where we're going, unfortunately.
Thanks. Yeah, and when I talk about a collision course, what I actually mean is more the fact that differentiation, which is EU policy, under the IRA definition, the way it's being implemented, as Anders said, the problem is very much implementation, interpretation. The implementation is being made in such a way that the argument is that differentiation is itself anti-Semitic. And that is the policy that Trump is leaving in place when he leaves office. That's the policy that's going to be behind this list that's going to come out. And I'm concerned that with the Biden administration, unless they unroll that, we're going to see a direct conflict and possibly one that Congress tries to further legislate. So that's just my concern.
If I may, we do have a stated position by Biden on opposing actions by both parties, unilateral actions that undermine a two-state settlement. And this would go exactly into the same direction. And I guess that is one of the conversations that Europeans and Americans will have to have when I speak about going back to the parameters, right?
We would hope so. I would point out, this is when I sound very negative, that it is under President Obama that two bills were signed into law that explicitly conflate settlements in Israel and make it US policy to oppose boycotts or trade differentiation between either. That was under Obama. So I'm not super optimistic here. I want to shift back to Anders. I want to open a new issue, and we're going to have to be pretty brief. We're starting to run short on time. Anders, I want you to talk about European perspectives on normalization. Normalization is something Europe has been pretty lukewarm about. Why is that? What do you think is going to happen? And I'm really interested also in as normalization with Israel and the Gulf states seems also to be about normalization of occupation, how that fits into European policy.
Yeah, and normalization of authoritarianism, don't forget that. But first of all, let me just say that while we were sitting here, Morocco has normalized relations with Israel. I saw it on the news flash, half an hour ago. I haven't read about it yet, but the peace train.
The great war between Israel and Morocco is over. We should celebrate.
But I mean, to go back, there are two big approaches to Middle Eastern peacemaking. One is called the inside-out approach. That means Israeli-Palestinian peace first, Israeli-Arab normalization later. And this is the approach that the European has been behind for 50 years. And not just been behind, but been fixated about. You know, the typical European politician would see the Middle East through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, meaning that this conflict has a strategic priority to Europe, that if this conflict is solved, you know, many other problems of the Middle East would also be solved or easier to handle. There is nothing more that an Israeli politician hates than this, what I call the European twin narrative about the conflict. So the Europeans have really been a supporter of the inside-out approach. What we see now, of course, is the other approach, the outside-in approach. That means Israeli-Arab normalization first, Israeli-Palestinian peace later. The fear, of course, in Europe is that there won't be Israeli-Palestinian peace later. And also, another fear is that we will see a continuation of what I told you before about the authoritarian tendencies in the Middle East. Peter Beinart wrote a fantastic article about this some time ago. And I told him, I retweeted him and I said, Peter, you forget to say that both Egypt and Jordan are more authoritarian today than they were when they signed the peace treaties with Israel in 1979 and 1994. That is a key, very important point to make. And also sort of the basic argument here is that in order to hold up the peace with Israel, these countries will have to hold their people down. This is what we see in the UAE today and in other places. We see, for example, that 70-80% of people in Sudan are against normalization with Israel. So this, of course, there is a big fears here, and also, but you can also turn it around and say that overall, European politicians are positive towards this, even if they are lukewarm, because there are also good aspects of it. I say, you know, these countries need to modernize, they need to open up. If they take anti-Semitism seriously, that will be good. So there are good things about it too. But as I said, will there be Israeli-Palestinian peace later? Few people believe that. What about sort of democracy? I mean, compare these normalization agreements to, say, a normalization agreement between the EU and a new state like Kosovo. And you will see a completely different text emphasizing multilateralism, human rights, democracy, you know, women's rights, and all these kind of things that are absent in most of these texts, a little bit exception for the Sudan agreement. So these are sort of some of the responses that we hear from Europe today.
I would add one irony is I'm old enough to remember when the argument was that Israel could not make peace with the Palestinians until they had all these reforms and did all of those things, because you can't make peace with an undemocratic Palestinian people, even though at that point there was strong Palestinian popular support for making peace.
This is Netanyahu 20 years ago.
It's really, there is an irony there. Okay, we're running short on time. Dimitris, I want you to also weigh in on the normalization question, on how the EU assesses and addresses these new alliances, and how the EU sees internal Palestinian-Israeli politics, both of which are in flux. And I want you to do it quickly because we have to get to Alex and then we'll wrap up.
I'll do my best, thank you. I mean, I agree with what Anders said, so I don't want to repeat what Anders said. Maybe two things. I mean, first of all, I call it alliance, not normalization, because the relations were normal anyway before. And the UAE and Bahrain in particular, but also Saudi Arabia, had increasing bilateral relations anyway. I think it's good to understand the main aims at the core of this alliance. Firstly, confronting Iran. Secondly, containing Turkey. I mean, these are the main reasons behind all this. But as Anders mentioned, you know, in flipping the order by putting regional peace before Palestinian peace, what has happened is that the United Arab Emirates is removing a key incentive for Israel, a key incentive that Israel might have had to end its occupation. As was also, and someone mentioned in the beginning, the idea of land for peace. This agreement also moves away from this well-established land for peace model, which was the basis for negotiations with Egypt and with Jordan. And it was also the basis of the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. I know that people tend to forget the Arab Peace Initiative, but it was there, it's still there. if anything, Israel is the big winner of these agreements because it did not have to do any concession for those. Yes, the welcoming by the EU was lukewarm. I think Borrell described it as a fundamental step for stabilization in the region. But I mean, what this process has shown, or has confirmed, is the EU's irrelevance in a potential significant political development for the Middle East in general, but also for Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular. Very briefly, when it comes to internal Palestinian politics, as I mentioned, the EU is stuck with engaging with Palestinian governments which were never democratically elected, with a president whose term expired since 2009. In theory, the EU is in favor of Palestinian reconciliation, but I think this is mainly because they don't believe that it will happen. When it comes to internal Israeli politics, I think that what we're witnessing in the Israeli society in the last decade kind of mirrors what is happening within EU member states themselves, like all this shift towards right-wing policies and populism. And we have Hungary and Poland, and we talk a lot about these two countries. I think that the EU has realized, or is realizing, that it's becoming an irrelevant actor when it comes to successive Israeli governments and its ability to influence any kind of Israeli government policies. And I'll leave it here because we're running out of time, but thank you.
So that's great. And that's a great lead in to Alex, because I want to give Alex the last word, because every time I talk to Alex, Alex says something that makes me try to be hopeful, to try to, you say this is really solidifying the irrelevance of the EU. I'm hoping that Alex, looking at this, and again, we've talked about this, talk about some of the specific aspects of the conflict where you think the EU can still play a particularly important role in the coming period. And what would that look like?
I will try. I think there is always a danger between us, like the more intellectual people here, to always think, but sometimes it's less about thinking and it's more about doing. So I think I'm less pessimistic about generally EU's role and their support basically for the Palestinians, wanting this state building, which let's just pause for a second and really appreciate it and think about what would be happening also without it. Of course, there's a lot of, consequences that can come from it, but it's not nothing. I would also say that particularly European support for both Palestinian and Israeli civil society, as well as European civil society that works on these issues, is super important, and I think it's very important to keep bringing these voices to Europe, to actually meet with the officials here, both in Brussels and in the capitals, in order to actually do the doing, right? To push the EU to act on, some of its promises. It's more specifically about an area, I think, where the EU can play quite a significant role is indeed Area C, as was mentioned already before. I think we see a lot of efforts generally to undermine, Palestinian presence in the area. It's really concerning what's happening with regards to, some of the discussions basically had in Knesset about the so-called struggle over Area C. I think EU is already very much engaged, very much following everything that is happening on the ground. It's quite impressive, I would say, from some of the conversations here with the officials. I think there's a lot of untapped potential that can be further explored, how the EU can contribute to territorial contiguity and really hold the line, but also now basically actively promote the line. As you remember yourself from the conversations we had in here in Europe before, there will really be a new phase, I think, where the EU will have to step up basically its commitment. And I think an Area C is one of the really good ways how to engage, basically.
Thank you. And I like that framing. I often talk about Europe's role in holding the line on keeping the possibility of peace alive. And I like the idea that shifting now to actually promoting the line, that may be a really critical EU role. So that's a great place to end. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank all 4 of our panelists for giving us so much of your time and your expertise. It was wonderful. For folks who want to learn more about this, we have more resources that we've posted on our website, along with a link to this video. Check out all of our guests via Twitter and Some of them have academic websites and organizational websites, tremendous resources available there. Lastly, I'll make another pitch. We have another webinar coming up this Monday, specifically on the IHRA definition and global views. It's going to be fascinating. You can find details about that and all of our other work at www.fmep.org. So with that, we will end this exactly at 12:30. I'm amazed. I wish we could have gone on longer. Thank you all so much. And thanks for everyone who joined us and sent us questions. Your questions will be shared. If they weren't used, they will be shared in writing with the panelists so they will know what you're interested in, and that can help inform their own thinking and their writing. And with that, farewell.
Thank you so much, Lara.
Thank you.